All right, hey folks. So today we are doing the final part of the Improving Squat Flexibility series. And we're going to wrap it up today with a look at some form tips and a summary of what we've covered so far in the first two parts, and also some recommendations for how to implement this moving forward. So firstly, let's go ahead with the notes. Just remind everyone, who is this for? This is for if you have a very sort of bent over, good morning style squat. If you're a powerlifter, that can lead to very inconsistent squat depth. If you are a bodybuilder or someone who's a fitness muscle enthusiast, then that's not the best style of squat for great quad growth. And so that's who this is for. If you want to just get better at squatting for your own personal reasons, whether you're a powerlifter or not, if you just fancy getting better at squatting, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, nowadays, with gyms closing and whatnot, we don't know what equipment we have access to. And if we have access to just something basic like a squat rack and a bar, it's quite useful to be able to squat correctly. So it's a nice skill to be able to learn. It's not always about, growing muscles and beating your numbers. Sometimes it's about actually just getting better. And that's a nice goal itself. Now, I do understand why coaches don't typically want to coach a squat and they shy away from the barbell movements, like the whole, anti-barbell kind of culture. I understand why, because before I got into coaching heavily, it was something that I was quite passionate about, that people should squat, and because mostly I didn't have a very good squat when I first started, as in it looked ugly, and that's what this series is about. It's about fixing an ugly looking squat. And I was strong, but it was an ugly looking squat. So I was quite passionate about getting people to learn how to squat correctly, because that's what I did. And it improved my athletic prowess all round. So if I could squat better, then I could do everything better. My hack squats were better. My leg presses were better. Everything was better. I could just do squatting type movements better. So I was quite passionate about it. But as I've gone into coaching more and more, I understand why coaches shy away from it, because as a coach, your primary job is generally to get the client results. And if the client has hired you to get them fat loss and muscle building results, you don't necessarily want to take the potentially 6 to 12 months to fix their squat while putting their leg development on hold. So I understand why coaches shy away from it, but I still believe there's value in at least knowing how to fix a squat if that's what a problem is. So that's what this series is about. All right, so the problem areas identified are mostly calves, quads, and thoracic back. Now, in parts 1 and 2, I went over flexibility for those areas, how to improve flexibility, and what some of the common mistakes are. So I don't want to cover those again. Now, getting straight into some form tips. First one is, when you get under the bar, when you actually rack the bar, that should be, for most people, the most uncomfortable part of the lift. The amount of times I see people just jumping under the squat bar and then going for it, because they're really hyped up, screaming, shouting. Some guys will headbutt the bar and they'll just jump under the bar and then take it out. And you're like, whoa, you're not tight. You haven't shrugged your shoulders back. You've not got your elbows in the right position. You've just gone on pure sort of energy. Take your time getting really wedged in, okay? Hands should be as close as you can hold comfortably. Elbows should be driven down and the shoulder blades should be pulled back. Really focus on driving the shoulder blades back to create a shelf for the bar to sit on. And you want to drive yourself really underneath the bar. So the bar should be a little bit behind you almost, because it's on the meat of your traps. And that's if you're low bar. If it's high bar, of course, it'll be right on top of you. But either way, you shouldn't be hunched over with the bar just pressing down on you. And you should try and have your hands as close together as comfortable with your elbows driven down. If you're going to insist on having your elbows back, well, your hands are going to have to be out wide. But that, as I'll explain, and I have talked about with the thoracic region, that's not the right way to do things. So the rack, take your time with the rack. That should be the most uncomfortable part of the lift. Most people spend hardly any time with the racking and then spend lots of time pitter-pattering their feet with the walkout. It should be the opposite. The rack should be take your time. The walkout should be maximum 3 steps. Left, right, center, done. All right, next. Elbows should point down and not back. So people have their elbows back because they're hunched over. So they've forced themselves into this quickly into position, and then they've just hunched themselves over by having their elbows back. So what they're doing is they're literally pushing the bar into the upper back to stay in position. So they're leant over, and the bar is essentially on the back as they're leant over. And because of that, they have to hold the bar in place. So it causes a lot of stress on the elbows as people go down. You typically see with people with really bad squat form what happens is they get a lot of elbow pain, elbow tendonitis, simply because of this. They've not taken the time into getting the bar into position, and as a result, they're leant over. So the bar, they have to lean over to keep the bar in position because there's no shelf. And on top of that, they have to have their elbows back to then push the bar into their upper back from behind. So as they go down, they're getting a whole lot of elbow pain because it's literally the arms which are keeping the bar into place. Now, if your thoracic region is flexible enough, you don't need to do that. Like if you have enough thoracic flexibility, what will happen is you will be able to stand upright as your lower back leans down under you, away from you, and the bar can sit correctly on your upper back. The bar will simply sit on your back and your elbows can go underneath if you have enough thoracic flexibility and are able to pull your shoulders back enough. You don't need to do this hunched over style of lifting. So this is a picture of Chad Wesley Smith. And Chad Wesley Smith weighs just over 300 pounds in this picture, and he has absolutely perfect squat form. So for those of you sat there thinking, I'm too big, you're not too big, you are too inflexible. That is your problem. And you don't know how to position your elbows and your shoulders when you're squatting. Your elbow should point directly down, your back should be drilled right back, and you should form a shelf. That is how you create efficient squat form. Now, the reason that you do that is so that when you squat down, you are better able to squat between your thighs rather than on top of your thighs. And for all but the most genetically gifted squatters, that's what's going to happen if you lean forward. So next up, as you descend, here's a few cues that I want you to focus on. One is opening up your hips. You want to allow your torso to sit down between your hips. You don't want a situation where you're squatting on top of your thighs. There's a distinct difference there. Squatting between your legs, so opening up your hips and squatting down between your legs, is distinctly different from just folding on top of them, okay, like an accordion. You don't want to do that. You want to be squatting down between your legs. So you've heard the cue of shoving your knees out. That's fine, okay? But you can still sit on top of your knees if you're shoving your knees out. You can still fold up if you're shoving your knees out. What you actually want to do is shove your knees forward, not out, right? They will go out a little bit, but mostly forward. Now, if you shift your knees, say an inch forward, right, then what's going to happen to your hips? Well, your hips will follow. So if you keep your knees like parallel by when you squat down, your hips are going to go out, because as you anchor down, your ass is going to go out. You don't want your ass to go out. So you need your hips, you need your knees to move forward slightly so that your torso can come down more close to vertical. It's never going to be fully vertical, but certainly more close to vertical. If you have zero calf flexibility and you insist on having this whole vertical shins thing that some people promote, then, well, your hips is going to shoot straight out. The more you can get your knees forward, the more your hips will also move forward, and you can then accomplish a better looking squat because your torso is more close to being vertical as it comes down. It's never going to be fully vertical, of course, and depending on the way you're built, it might not be very vertical at all, but at least it'll be slightly more than it used to be, especially if you combine that with the other tips. And finally, think of driving your hips forward and your chest up, okay? So as you descend, you should think about driving your chest up, right? Your hips forward and your knees forward and out. That is the way you squat. Think about combining those three things as you go down, and that will give you the best chance of having a good looking squat. So next up is programming basics. So we can talk about all the form tips we like, but then how do we actually drill that? Because there's no way you can do that with your regular squat form right now. There's no way, if you're a 3-plate side squatter and that's what you do for 5 reps, well, there's no way you can implement these tips on your first day with 3 plates aside. That's not the way it works. What we have to do is we have to lower the weight low enough to enable us to perform deep squats with the form tips that I'm talking about with reasonable form. So the weight needs to be low enough to allow you to actually replicate something close to what I'm talking about here. Now, with the weight low enough, that's going to allow you to do things frequently. So when I started to rebuild my squat, I was looking at doing it, I started doing it 3 days a week because I was only using 60 kilos. At the time, I was well over a 200 kilo squatter. And I only, about 5-plate side squat, about 220 squatter. So I wanted to rebuild my squat from the ground up so I could get better squat depth. And so I started with 60. 60 kilos done with absolutely perfect form, driving the elbows down, keeping the shoulders back, opening the hips up, shoving the knees forward, keeping the chest high, 3 sets of 8. And I did that 3 days a week. Now, what I would do is I would add 2.5 kilos whenever I managed to drill that weight for all 3 sets of 8. So generally it would be 3 sets of 8 on a Monday with 60, and then I would add 2.5 kilos assuming Monday went well. And assuming Wednesday went well, I would then go to Friday and do 65. So that 2.5 kilos every single session, 3 days a week, actually builds up pretty fast. So within a week, you're up 7.5 kilos. Within a month, you're up 30 kilos up to 90, and then so on and so forth. It takes you a while to get right the way back up to the big heights, and sometimes you might have to redo a weight. You'll get to a certain weight where it's quite challenging. You're like, okay, my form's starting to go. I've got to pull back. You must only practice perfect reps. You can't get into a situation where you're allowing yourself to just slack off when it gets challenging and go back to your old form. Your body is always going to try. Your body's always going to try and get back to excellent. Your body's always going to try and get back to the form that it's most strongest in. What you have to do over the course of the next sort of 6 months or 3 months is you have to drill form, which is what you want it to be. You cannot allow yourself to get back to the type of form you used to be, because that's what currently you're strongest in. That's why you're lifting more in that. The problem is, of course, you're lifting it, it's inconsistent depth, and also it's not providing the right development. It's not the lift you want. So where people screw this up is they increase the weight too quickly. The body is always going to aim to use its strongest movement path to accomplish the lift. It's always going to resort to its strongest muscles to lift the weight up. It doesn't really care about perfect form. Your responsibility is to keep drilling perfect form. All right. Now the analogy is this: it's kind of like relearning to drive. Let's say you learned to drive when you were a teenager because your dad used to take you out in the car and you picked up some bad habits. He had some bad habits and you picked those up. So you would just do things with the clutch. You would ride the clutch or whatever. You wouldn't signal, all that kind of stuff, right? And when it comes to your driving lessons, the driving instructor was like, some things you do great, but some things you have some really bad habits. You picked them up from somewhere, and you have to just re-drill those habits into your brain and learn all the right stuff. It's kind of like that with squatting. If you're looking to relearn form for the form to be more like what we're discussing here, then you can't allow yourself to go back to bad habits when the going gets tough. You have to keep drilling those, and you have to be disciplined with that. So that's kind of where people screw up. You've got to have the patience to make sure your form is pristine every single rep as you rebuild back up again. So one other sort of insight here into regards to form is, you've heard a lot of discussion about where your head should be, and that's probably like an extra question. When you do this right, the question about where your head should go becomes irrelevant, because as long as you keep your head fairly neutral to up, it'll be in the right position. People only really ask this when they're doing the low bar bent over style squat, because they're like, you shove your head up. This doesn't become a question which is even relevant if you're squatting correctly in this manner, because your torso is going to be more upright anyway. So as long as you're looking either neutral to slightly up, you'll be in the right place. Most people who really focus on the head up cue tend to be low bar squatters, because they're just like, or like straight ahead, somewhere on the 4. It's because they're low bar squatters. So if they keep their head neutral, they're going to be looking down, because they promote that. Now there's nothing wrong with low bar, and actually you can do this style of squatting low bar as well. I do sometimes. But the point is that if you are getting if you're drilling the right squat form with your thoracic region nice and tight, and your torso coming down between your legs, where you're looking will become an irrelevant question, because you should be mostly looking either forward or whatever, something along those lines. So it just doesn't become a question worth asking. You're not having to really exaggerate the upward look. All right, so here's kind of a rough training plan. Squat 3x8 Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Add 2.5 kilos if and only if the form was perfect. So video your lifts. And also, as well as videoing the lifts, get a feel for what is good form. You know when you've squatted hunched over, bent over, right? And you also know when you've squatted correctly. So in the early stages, additional work in the form of like feet low hack squats and leg presses can be performed, because your legs aren't really going to get that much actual hard work, because you'll be limited by your form. So initially, you may want to add in some additional leg work as well as these squats for 3 sets, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Later on, as you get stronger with the great form, your quads will blow up from that form anyway. So, but this is something which I think you should bank on taking about 6 months. That's how long it took for me, about 6 to 9 months. For some of you, it might be quicker. You might not be coming from a place where I was trying to change my squat form a decade after using low bar, inconsistent depth, wide stance form. So this is a kind of a rough plan, and that's I bank on it taking about that long, but hopefully for you guys it might not be quite so long. So hopefully you guys have found that useful. That's the full 3-part series. So in this series, I've covered flexibility for all the relevant areas. I've also covered some of the basics of form and really breaking down the different areas from the unrack into how you should hold your shoulders, what you should do with your hips, your knees, your thoracic region, your upper back as you're squatting, and also somewhat of a plan on how to implement this and really drill in excellent squat form over what could be half a year. And as I said right at the beginning of this video, this is not something which I always recommend doing, but it is specifically for people who want better depth, who want less elbow pain, and who also may just not be comfortable with squatting the way they were previously and want to squat in a way which looks nicer. So it's a skill to learn. So hopefully that was useful, and I'll call it there. Speak to you next time.